Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time, and this is Starfleet Tactical. I, of course, am Chris Weuve, who is not speaking for his employer. And I have with me this evening long-time returning frequent guest, Chris Carlson, who presumably is speaking for his employer since he's self-employed these days. How are you, Chris?
Dealing with cottonwoods.
Yeah. The trees need to go get a room.
Yeah. Well, we've had so much water because we had a very, 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 very wet spring, and so they're producing in quantities.
They're just jerking off all around you.
And my sinuses are taking umbrage.
I understand. So, I don't know. I don't think I'm really that allergic to trees. I'm allergic to grasses and stuff like that.
Yeah, but, I'm the exact opposite.
Yeah, everybody I know who's allergic to trees, there's like that one tree that they're miserable for 2 weeks. So, but let's see. It's been a while since we did a show. In between the last show and this show, I went off to the Connections Wargaming Conference in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, hosted by the Army Heritage and Education Command, I think, or Center, Army Heritage and Education. Mm-hmm. It's right outside of Carlisle Barracks. Nice little facility. Had a reasonably good time. Got to see a bunch of people I hadn't seen in forever. Didn't get to see a few people that I thought I was going to see there that just weren't there for whatever reason, but it was a pretty good time overall. So I went with Merl Robinson, who has not yet been on the show.
How's he avoided that?
Well, Merle's been telling me tales. He tells me the tale of this Starfleet. I'm trying to remember the exact topic, but he's got a Star Trek topic. And the problem is it's like 3 episodes long, and he needs to break it into 3 parts. But he just hasn't had the time to do that. And because he's one of the principals with the National Security Decision-Making game, everybody, if you go to like Gen Con or Dragon Con or something like that, you got a chance to play NSDM or go to any of their events, you really should, because they're fantastic. But because he's been busy with that, he's basically one of the pillars that holds that thing up. He just hasn't had the time. And so I was talking with him about it earlier today, and I said, yeah, my guess is you're not going to be able to do it, and certainly not before Gen Con, and probably not until after Dragon Con. And he said, yeah, there's a chance before Dragon Con, but really probably not. So I'm hoping that at that time point, I can bring him in for a couple of episodes. Because I've got a bunch of stuff on my list of things that I want to talk about, but a lot of them involves things that are going to take a little bit of effort on my part. It take a lot of reading. So Merle is actually posting. He said it's a Trek Breaking Tech. It's a presentation on all the things that they created that really should just break the setting, starting with the transporter and the replicators. Mm-hmm. So now he's saying he is trying to guilt me into activity and that it will probably work. So,
sorry,
no,
Merle.
I mean, I can read his calendar. I mean, he's also the other guy who one of the other guys who puts on Connections US with me. So I know that he's busy doing stuff with that, although our event's in April, so we got a lot of time. But I know what his schedule looks like. And so I'm not inclined to guilt him during the parts of the year where I know that he's really, really busy. But after Dragon Con, I'm going to go red and free on him. So for those of you who have not been in the Navy, let's see, it's threat condition red, weapons posture free, if I remember the exact details. And so basically what I just said there was Any unknowns can be treated as hostile, and you are authorized to fire.
Classification by ordnance.
Yeah, and so that stuff is actually that would be a good topic for a show, as what happens in a red alert in Star Trek terms, and what happens, what's the functional equivalent of that in the U.S. Navy. In fact, I'm going to write that down because otherwise I'm going to forget. Okay, if I can find a working pen. Red and free star. Okay. I will take that back with me and add it to the very, 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 very long list of topics. I mean, seriously, it's like a page long list of topics that I want to do. It's just, I'm at the point now where there's two issues associated with all the stuff that's on my list of things to do. First of all, they all require some amount of research, if nothing else, just reading a book. But they're also things that are very heavily interrelated. And so I need to figure out how to break the links without breaking the links. I need to figure out how to make it in digestible chunks without just coming on and saying, hey, guess what? Tonight's show is going to be 8 hours long. So, yeah, because that doesn't work. So One Horse Shay says, wouldn't red alert equal general quarters and battle stations? And so the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's more complicated than that. If you go to the sacred text, which is the Star Trek Next Generation Technical Manual by Rick Sternbach, whose birthday it is today. Happy birthday, Rick. And Mike Okuda. There's actually a set of predetermined actions that happen when they go to a particular alert level, like level 1 diagnostics run on the computers, and this is done and that's done and all these other things are done. And that's actually the same as is the case in a Navy vessel. And of course, because it's always more complicated in the real world, there's a whole bunch of other things other than just battle, going to general quarters and going to this and going to that, et cetera, et cetera. You have, for instance, the restricted maneuvering doctrine. Chris, is there anything do you have restricted maneuvering on submarines? Is it always restricted?
There are things we're not supposed to do.
Okay, so the restricted maneuvering doctrine is whenever you're in a situation where, now, it's worth pointing out, the last time I went to sea was November 2004, so I am 2 damn decades out of date. The second thing is that my viewpoint was very idiosyncratic. So I never had the class, right? I got to watch them do stuff, but it's not like I went to surface warfare officer school, got to watch a lot of SWOs do their thing. But my knowledge can be idiosyncratic. So I first encountered something called the restricted maneuvering doctrine when I was standing on the bridge wing of USS O'Kane, and they came over the 1MC, the intercom. We were about to do an underway replenishment, and they said, the voice on the loudspeaker said, the restricted maneuvering doctrine is in effect. And about 15 seconds later, a big black puff of smoke came out of one of the smokestacks. Want to guess, Mr. Nuke guy? You want to guess what just happened?
You're not supposed to get black smoke out of a gas turbine like that.
You do when you start it up.
Well, yeah, when you start them up, but not when they're running.
So what they were doing was one of the things about the restricted maneuvering doctrine is when you declare restricted maneuvering, which means one of the things about restricted maneuvering, it means I may need a lot of power and I may need it really, really fast. So part of the standard protocol when you declare restricted maneuvering is you bring all 4 gas turbines online. And so normally if you're just tooling out there at 10 or 15 knots, you don't need 4 gas turbines online. You only need 2. I'm not even sure you need 2, but you'd have 2 online.
You have 2, yeah.
Because basically you always have 2 online. You don't want to drop the load.
This is always bad.
Yeah, and so you go ahead and you bring the other 2 online because you may need to go to full power on very, very short notice. And so you give them a chance to spin up and do everything that they need to do when they're in startup mode, and get them as part of the system so that you can go to full power if you need to. And that's because when you're doing underway replenishment, you may need to maneuver, and you may need to maneuver fast. Those things are very, very, ships don't turn easily. It's not like driving a car. It's, I think that unless you talk with somebody and you haven't seen it, you really don't appreciate the levels of delay and everything else that goes along with conning a ship. And so they always try to be ahead of that curve. And I've been on a carrier that had to do an emergency maneuver because we were doing an underway replenishment, and there was a problem. We were to the port of the oiler. There was a DDG, I think, to the starboard of the oiler, and that connection had a problem of some sort, like they broke a line or something. And it was whatever it was, I can't remember now because it was 20 some years ago. It was April of 2004, because I remember that was one of the trips I was at sea on my birthday. So I'm on a catwalk with a fellow CNA guy, and we're watching this thing, and something happened on the other side, and somebody came over the 1MC and said, "We've got an emergency. We're going to maneuver. Clear the catwalk now." And Scott and I looked at each other, and we both had the look on our face, and then we ran for our lives. Now, they were going to give us time to get inside the skin of the ship, but they basically said, everybody in the starboard catwalk, get off now. Which includes, anybody who was out doing flight deck and was just doing a transition from the flight deck, because that's how you get off the flight deck. You take a little steps down to the catwalk, and then you walk however far you need to until you can get to a door and get inside. So that's what was going on. So, oh well. Well, so Lissa is here. She popped in. She was running a little late, and she's waving at me, and now she can wave everybody else. So, Lissa, I hope you're doing well.
Tummy issues, but was pet sitting little dogs this week, as per my usual July 4th plans.
So if you don't feel well, there's no reason why you need to be here.
This is my usual Lissa doesn't feel well. This is status quo. Lissa doesn't feel well.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. A, I'm sorry to hear that. B, I totally and completely understand that as a guy that has some sleeping issues and, general, late 50s, it hurts sort of deal. I always
I have associated stomach issues with health things.
So, well, I hope you feel as good as you're capable of feeling. Let's put it that way.
I'm certainly trying. If nothing else, I'm trying.
That's good. That's good. I was just about to put up the slides because we do have slides tonight. So let me go ahead and do that.
I will disappear back into the void.
Goodbye. And let me get the right. That's the one I want. I went to the trouble of creating this format. Let's go ahead and use it. Okay, so this is at least a two-parter. It might be a three-parter. And it's unclear to me as to how far we're going to get tonight. And because we've got a thing that's a special bonus that we may do tonight, we may save it for next time, and we may do it for the time after. So who knows? Okay, so this is the somewhat Chris-centric schedule. You'll notice that a lot more of it got kind of orangish. And what was a probably for the 20th became a maybe. I was telling Chris that my schedule is changing. I get to go down to the Florida Panhandle for some business stuff, and then a couple of weeks later, I'm supposed to be the following weekend, I'm supposed to be back in Des Moines, where I am now, for the Weuve family reunion. And in between I may get to go to Bossier City, Louisiana, which is right outside of Shreveport. So this has the potential to be one of those living in my car sort of situations where I'll get to do like 3 or 4 8-hour drives over the course, 8 hours or more over the course of 2 weeks. I'm also thinking about, if I do this drive, there's one leg of it, like the Florida to Bossier City leg. I'm thinking about, or one of those legs, I'm trying to remember which one. I'm thinking about breaking up by going to Memphis and seeing the giant pyramid with the Bass Pro Shop in it, which has a hotel. And it's a relatively cheap hotel. So I'm thinking about going and actually seeing the giant, because it's like the 4th biggest pyramid in the world. And they didn't make it to put a Bass Pro Shop in it. It used to be a sports arena, but it wasn't a very good sports arena. And then the city sort of undercut it by building a brand new sports arena, like literally a half mile away. And so the teams that were playing in the pyramid left the pyramid. And so it just sat empty for a couple of years. And then Bass Pro Shops came along and said, well, we'll put a giant Bass Pro Shop in it if you'll let us. And they went, okay, whatever. And so they did. And it's got it's the only Bass Pro Shop I know of that has its own hotel. So I'm thinking about doing that. So you'll notice so I've got the next 3 to 4 topics that I think. One is going to be Robert working LCS, and that's going to be at least another week in addition to today. I want to do one on capital ships. I'm going to focus on Michael Vlahos's article trying to define exactly what we mean by capital ship. He wrote that back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, about the time that the battleships were being reactivated, if I remember correctly. And then I want to look at Mike Bosworth's carriers of large objects. This is a proposal back from the 1990s or so, maybe early 90s, when he's a naval architect who was at Naval Surface Warfare Center, Carderock. And he had some interesting ideas that I think are applicable to spacecraft, because basically one of them was a PT boat carrier sort of stuff. And so I think it's worth looking at. And then I'm probably going to wallow around in Traveler for a while, looking at all the Martin Doherty stuff. And because Martin Doherty's done a really good job of going back and retconning a bunch of the Traveler stuff to make it make sense. And it fits right in with the sort of stuff we do in this show. I mean, his explanation as to how the Imperial Navy is structured comes right out of Julian Corbett and the idea of the battle fleet and cruisers and the flotilla. And so it's clear from even the terminology he uses that he's read Corbett. He understands Corbett, and that's the model he was explicitly trying to do. So let's see. So here's what we're going to look at tonight. And that red part, the bonus, is the part that hopefully we'll get to. Chris has got the slides done. That's something that Chris put together. And if we don't get it to it this week, we'll get to it next week. So, okay. So a few caveats to start off with. Now, this mostly applies to me. I don't speak for my employer. You probably figured that out already. The second thing is I would describe both Chris and I as informed observers of the Littoral Combat Ship program. Note, neither one of us ever worked for that program. Chris, were you doing acquisition threat support stuff in the time when this was a big deal? Were you working on that stuff?
Yes.
Okay, so you probably got to look at some JSIDS documents and stuff like that.
Well, remember the JSIDS documents were done
after the fact.
After the fact, because remember, to be transformational, you had to be quick.
Yeah, and to be transformational, you had to throw all the rules out, and then you got to learn the lesson as to why those rules were there. There's the old saying that every OSHA regulation is written in blood.
Yeah.
Every JSIDS requirement is written in a $1 billion cost overrun at a minimum.
Oh, at a minimum.
If you're lucky, it's only $1 billion. So I did some of the similar work because basically Chris hired me to be his replacement when he retired. So I got to deal with the LCS office a little bit and got to do that. But during the time when all these decisions were being made, all the stuff that, like when Bob Work was writing the piece that we're looking at, during that time period, I was first at the Center for Naval Analysis, and during most of it, I was at the Naval War College. And so I know people who did LCS studies. I know people who participated in it. Some of the stuff from both the War College perspective and the Navy Warfare Development Command perspective. I know people who were associated with NWDC who were mad at other people at NWDC for stuff that they did. But I wasn't like involved in any of that stuff. And I didn't get to the War College. When I got to the War College, they weren't gaming it in global anymore. They had gamed it in global about 5 years before I got there. But by the time I got there, it wasn't being gamed in global. And they had totally changed the structure of the strategic studies group, and Sabrowski was long gone and all the other stuff. So I got to hear a lot of tales, but I didn't get to live that part directly. So I'm not going to do an overview of the history of the program or the history of the arguments for and against. I'm not going to talk about Sabrowski and Wayne Hughes and them making the comment that the ships would be expendable and how the Navy just basically had an allergic reaction to that, et cetera, et cetera. Some of that will come out in passing. I'm not really interested in detailing the history of that program. If you want to see the history of the arguments beforehand, read the 2004 work article, and then he's done some follow-on stuff after that. And then there's the ProPublica article that Chris, were you on the show for when I talked about
No.
ProPublica? Okay,
No.
So there was a ProPublica article that talked about what a shit show it was. And it filled in some details that even somebody who was at the Naval War College at the time and was paying attention to all this stuff, that some details I didn't know about. They got a few things. It's like, okay, there's another piece of that they missed. But in general, it's a pretty good article. If you want the history of the program and all the failure modes, et cetera, that's a place to go to. I'm not doing the history of the program. I'm not doing the history of the arguments of for and against. I'm not doing an assessment of the program. I'm certainly not doing an assessment of Bob Work, because Bob Work is he doesn't need me to do an assessment of it. But I am going to look at the arguments that Bob Work made in support of doing an LCS experiment, why he thought something like this was a good idea, what the history that he talked about, we're going to talk about some of that tonight, what he thought the arguments were in favor of doing it, etc. And then I'm going to look at what those arguments were, which ones of those arguments panned out, which one of those arguments seemed valid, and which ones were not really tested. Now, so I'm not getting into a lot of the stuff like, for instance, you can think that LCS was a good idea and still think that the Navy screwed it up. You can think that the LCS was a good idea and think that the vendor screwed it up. You can think that LCS was a really bad idea, but could have been a good idea, right? A lot of that stuff I'm not going to talk about the Navy stuff. I'm going to concentrate on the theoretical arguments that Bob Work made and what I think of those. And so why am I going to do that? And that's because you're all watching a show called Starfleet Tactical, right? So getting into the nitty-gritty details of all the failure modes of that program does not serve the idea of, I always tell people that my fandom superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. So I really want to set it up so that I can have a conversation about the science fiction aspects of it. And the theory part of that, and that piece of it is where that interesting thing is. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. If you're hearing the bong of my messages coming in, some of those messages are from Pat Doyle, who's currently in LA. He shared some pictures earlier today. He was standing on William Shatner's and James Doohan's stars on the Hollywood area. So he's there on business. Okay, so who's Bob Work? Bob Work is a retired colonel in the Marine Corps who, after he left the Marine Corps, he went to the Center for Strategy and Budgetary Assessment, I think is what CSBA stands for. Was there for a little over a decade, also did some academic stuff, taught on the side, et cetera, et cetera. He was then Undersecretary of the Navy for 4 years. He went to was the head of the Center for New American Security for about a year. Then he became the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense and was acting SecDef for a while during that time period. And so he's a very, very thoughtful guy. He's a guy he's a Marine. So he's not like a surface warfare officer, but he's very steeped in history. And he's one of the deep thinkers. And if he says something, it's worth at least listening to him. Even when he's wrong, he's worth listening to. So, Chris, have you ever met Bob Work?
I think a couple of times as part of a crowd. So
yeah.
Have he and I had a nice little chat sitting down face to face? No.
Okay. Chris and I both worked in a field where it's every now and then it's sort of surprising, like who you've met. Like Chris and a whole bunch of people in my office, but not me, have briefed the guy who's currently Secretary of the Air Force. I have not briefed him. But it's sort of interesting how all that works out. So in any event, Bob Works, he's written a lot of stuff. He's a very smart guy. He's worth reading. Okay, I'm going to do some slides that I did once before because it's been a while, and it's sort of essential to set the tone, to sort of set the background for it. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. So when we talk about the Littoral Combat Ship, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about two classes of ship. The one I really should have them reversed here because the one on the right is the LCS-1 class. That's the Freedom class. The one on the left is the LCS-2 class. That's the Independence class. Both the Freedom and the Independence are no longer in commission. They were mostly test ships, and they didn't plan to keep them around as long as they were the other ones. But LCS is a program that's had some issues. The weird shape of LCS-2 is because that is a trimaran. The center hull is way bigger than the outrider hulls, but the trimaran has a couple of features. One is that it lowers the wetted area of the hull, and as a result, there's less drag. And it also has the feature of making stress in very interesting places, leading to an increased probability of cracking your hull. Did I miss anything in there, Chris?
No.
I also understand.
You have also mentioned the fact that because the Navy punted on the cathodic protection,
yes,
they ended up with a ship that accelerated that problem by dissolving.
Yeah, the Navy built a water soluble ship because they have some of the components are made of steel. Some of the components in the water are made of steel. The tunnels that the water jets run through are made of steel, and they're connected to aluminum parts. And when you have dissimilar metals like that, you set up a current, which causes the ship to want to dissolve. Anybody who owns a pleasure boat understands this idea of cathodic protection. You have usually on a pleasure boat, you have sacrificial zinc anodes that the current will dissolve the zinc anodes, and you have to occasionally put a new one on. The problem is that zinc and aluminum are close enough to each other in the periodic table that the ocean was unpersuaded that it should be dissolving the zinc rather than the aluminum. And the maker of the boat said, maker of the ship said, hey, we think this is a bad idea. And the Navy said, trust us, we know what we're doing. And it was really a case of the Navy. I've worked for the Navy for about 20 years in one way, shape, or form, right? I was a naval analyst for about 20 years. And I've never run into an organization like the U.S. Navy that was so capable of adopting the conclusion slide while rejecting the assumption slide. And they really seem to think that if they changed the words on the PowerPoint slide, that somehow affected reality. And so they just decided they didn't want to pay for a cathodic protection system, an active protection system that actually ran a current, because that was too expensive. And so we'll just use sacrificial anodes. And the first time they took the hull out of the water, they found huge holes in the hull, like this big. And they went, I don't think it's supposed to do that. So yeah. So in any event, it's a modular warship in that it has mission packages that they would bring on board. A mission package consists of a module, one or more modules, which are basically in Connex boxes, think 20-foot equivalent units. And then a package also has whatever mission crew comes aboard to work that gear. Plus, if it needs an aircraft, the aircraft is part of the mission package also. The module contains the systems and support equipment that you need to make that module work. And then the systems are just, like the system might be a UUV that you could dump over the side, or a UAV or something like that. And then it's whatever sensors or weapons go along with it. So it's a very, very interesting idea. It's a very interesting idea. And it would be groundbreaking if it worked. And we'll go into a little bit of the reasons why it didn't work. It was there were a couple of places where laws of physics just got in the way. Engineering stuff got in the way. It just was too expensive to try to do what they wanted to do, even if it were possible to do it. It was just too expensive. So we'll talk about that later. So here's the Freedom class. Steel hull with aluminum superstructure. It's a semi-planing hull, so it's the same idea as a torpedo boat, a PT boat from World War II. If you look at World War II torpedo boats, they seem to be very high on the water. You see that in speedboats too, and that's because it's a planing hull. They're shallow draft and kind of a flat bottom, and they get up on it, and it lowers the wetted area of the hull. They'd had weight issues while it was still on the drawing board, let alone when they actually got it in the water. So, and it's about 3,900 tons full load. So, any particular thoughts on this, Chris?
Well, we've talked about this before, but if you look at the mission module spaces,
you've got all that area underneath the flight deck is basically big open areas where you can bring on board all the Connex boxes and modules and all the other gear that you have.
As same with under the hangar. That you have the first compartment is the water access, and then you have two reconfigurable compartments, and they put those bulkheads in there, which really complicate life.
So how did they get I know a little bit more about Independence class and Freedom class. How did they get the mission modules into the area under the hangar? Did they come in through the on the same level through the aft, or did they have to lower them through the hangar floor?
I have not seen anything that talks about that. However, when you read about the ramp that they have on the starboard side, the wording leads you to believe that everything comes in through there, and then it gets pushed through the openings between the bulkheads, which must make for real interesting evolution.
So it comes in through the starboard side and then it gets pushed aft?
Well, no, actually, if you look where the boat is, that's where your hatch is. That's where the loading ramp is. So it comes in aft and they pull it forward.
Okay. All right. So here's the Independence class, and this is a much better view to see what's going on there. First of all, it's got a humongous flight deck. Just humongous. It's like this. The only ships in the fleet that have bigger flight decks than the LCS-2 class are the amphibs and the aircraft carriers. So ships that are 2 to 3 times as big as these things have smaller flight decks.
It also has a much larger mission module bay.
Yeah, and the mission module bay is a lot larger also. But I know that through that forward bay, I believe they I thought I remembered somewhere that they lowered stuff in through the top. Am I wrong on that, or did that come in through the side?
So you can see the starboard side mission access.
Yeah. So it's like I said, it's a trimaran. It's all aluminum except for those steel thrust tunnels, which causes the problem. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, you can sort of see the configuration of that trimaran hull. Trimarans have cracking problems. Aluminum is kind of prone to cracking. Basically, a trimaran is 3 different ships that are sort of bolted together, and they have a tendency to want to go in 3 different directions at the same time, and that can lead to cracking. And did I mention that it has hull cracking problems? So yeah, it can be problematic, but it's got that huge flight. I mean, I am in love with that flight deck in Mission Bay. Right. And I was telling Chris beforehand, I want to go through and do some counting because we're losing Ticonderoga class cruisers, and they carried hangars for their helicopters. And until they started building the Flight 2A Arleigh Burkes, so the first 30 some Burkes we built did not have hangars, so they could hot pump a helicopter, and they had a RAST system so they could pull a helicopter down, but they didn't actually. I think they had RAST. Pretty sure they had RAST. Oh, maybe they don't, because maybe they don't. I have to think about that. So in any event, the RAST is something that lets you land a helicopter in bad weather. Basically, you lower a line down to the deck while you're hovering above. You have to stay up high enough because the ship is going up and down, and so you want to make sure that you don't get slapped by the ship. You lower a line down, you pull up a cable, you connect the cable to your helicopter, and then the pilot gives it up while the ship winches it down to the deck. And as a result of that, because the helicopter wants to go up, there's never a situation where the helicopter is staying level and the ship is coming up to meet it. It's always a case of, if the ship is moving, the helicopter is in perfect unison. And so you basically winch it down to the deck. And that's a big deal. And it means that you can conduct flight ops in some sea states that are otherwise problematic. But I look at the LCS-2 class and just look at it and go, I'm in love with that hangar. I'm in love with that mission bay. I'm in love with that flight deck. If I had a Navy that needed extra flight decks, this might be a way to get extra flight decks, especially if you've already built them. But I haven't done any of the math on that. It might be that it's a dumb idea. You can't know until you actually do the analysis. Okay. Any other thoughts on this one?
The drawing here shows that the mission module bay itself is actually kind of broken up into 3 sections of thwart ships, because you'll see a lot of stanchions in there because you want to keep the helicopter on the helipad and not in the mission bay.
Yes.
So that's a little problematic in terms of how many containers or how many ribs or UUVs, UAVs you can get in there. But overall, the LCS-2 mission module volume is far better than in the LCS-1s.
Yeah. If you're going to land planes on the roof, you kind of need to reinforce things.
Yeah, little things like that.
So my mom never let me land airplanes on my roof for that reason. So it's worth pointing out that other people have ideas like this, and they have big bays too. Like this is a Royal Danish Navy Absalon class command and support ship. They've done follow-ons to this ship that do not have as much bay capability. They have more weapons by default in a smaller bay. But I absolutely love these things. I absolutely love them. They're a little light on the weapons for the size of the ship it is, but it's just this nice little capability to move stuff around. I could do a lot with a ship like this, and I think this is actually a very from a science fiction perspective, this is a very salient type of system, right? When I think of the corvette transports that Juan Rico in Starship Troopers talks about, how the mobile infantry prefers corvette transports because they can do little penny packets wherever they need to, and the Navy always wants to have big things. This is a corvette transport, right? This is the sort of thing that I think that Juan Rico was talking about. This thing probably doesn't, I don't remember how many troops it can carry. I think it's really designed to carry a motorized rifle company, if I remember correctly. But as you can see, it can carry tanks. This is pretty nifty. So in the real world, there's different kinds of modularity. And if you want to see that stuff, you can go back and look at the previous episode that I did that was all about modularity. It's the first modularity type stuff that people started doing was construction modularity. And then it sort of went on to shipyard swappable pre-configured systems, and then stuff that you could reconfigure, and mission modularity and stuff like that. Now, one of the things that I'll probably talk about next week is Work does a little bit of history, and he talked, and I had sort of kind of missed the importance of the four-piper destroyer, and that this is a design, a U.S. destroyer design from World War I that was built using some modular techniques, which meant that you could actually remove pieces of it and reconfigure it. Now, not at the level of, you just pull in the port and you pull stuff out and you're ready to go 3 days later, but it was at the level of you go in and 6 weeks later, you've got a new capability. So they turned these things into fast transports. They turned them into mine layers. They turned them into mine hunters. They turned them into a whole bunch of different things. And we built like 100 of them. We had a shit ton of them. And so they were used all throughout World War II. If we needed a special purpose ship to go, we needed things to land small numbers of Marines. So we'll take a destroyer and we'll convert it into a destroyer transport. That actually is probably what Robert Heinlein had in mind when he wrote about the Corvette transport. I suspect that is the exact ship that he had in mind. So, and the module on the right-hand side is a Standflex module for a variable depth sonar, if I remember correctly. Does that look like a video?
That's what it looks like.
Yeah. So Standflex is really cool. The Danes didn't have enough money to replace ships that needed to be replaced on a one-for-one basis, so they built ships where you could swap out the weapons systems. So they basically have sockets, and you can swap stuff out. And the idea was that you could go in and spend a couple of days in a shipyard, and then you leave, and you've got your new fit. One of the things the Danes discovered is, you can swap out the gear that quickly, but that doesn't mean anybody's trained on it. And so even if you had been trained on it previously, you still needed refresher training, and all that stuff sort of worked out to that was a much bigger deal than the actual swapping of the modules is, which means that's a really interesting to think about, something to think about from a science fiction perspective, or actually, it's a really interesting thing to think about from a real world perspective. How do you create a situation where you save all this time and then you immediately lose it all again because you're stuck retraining all your guys, right? So I could see a value in keeping LCS-1 and LCS-2 around, even if they never went to sea, just because it would give people an opportunity to practice moving modules on board, taking modules off, and function as in the import trainer. Assuming you weren't in the process of getting rid of the entire class, that is. So, Chris, any thoughts on this?
When you talk about, because we've talked about Stanflex before.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of things that that folks need to realize. One, they're not big ships.
No.
They don't deploy that much. And their reconfiguration is done in a shipyard.
Yeah. I think it needs a 32-ton crane, if I remember correctly.
So, yeah, something that's, and the access to the personnel that can move all this stuff around.
I'm sorry, it's a 15-ton crane for Stanflex. There's something else where you need a 32-ton crane, but I think Stanflex is a 15-ton crane. So
both of these issues were to be addressed by the LCS ships.
Yeah.
And they didn't address it properly, if at all. I don't know if they did. They may just have assumed it won't be hard. And it proved to be a lot harder because the swapping issue largely killed the whole concept of LCS because they couldn't do it operationally.
Yeah, the entire idea behind it was you should be able to pull into any port. And
yep.
with relatively low grade cranes, you should be able to, basically just stuff that you would use to handle containers. You shouldn't need any specialized equipment, etc. And you should be able to just swap all this stuff around. And it turned out not to be nearly as easy as I thought it was going to be. In some cases because of software issues, in other cases because they didn't have the wide variety of modules that they needed, so it just wasn't worth the effort to get any better at it. And one of the things is frequently this happens with airplanes all the times, but it also happens with ships where it's like, we contracted for them to build the thing that does X and we get it and it doesn't quite do X, or maybe it really doesn't do X. And it's like, what's wrong with these guys? Why are they bozos? Well, when you're inventing a new thing, it's hard to sort of predict when you're pushing the envelope, it's hard to predict exactly where the edge of the envelope is. And in some cases, things end up being harder than they thought it was going to be. This is also with mundane things like doing refurbishments. There's been a big deal made out about how the Navy was doing modernization upgrades to a bunch of Tychos, Ticonderoga class cruisers, and they would get $60 million in and then change their mind and decide not to do that. It's like, well, how on earth could that be, right? Why would you spend $60 million on a ship that you weren't going to finish? And the answer is, when you spent the $60 million, when you allocated the $60 million, when you contracted for that, you thought you were going to go all the way. But as you worked through it, you discovered it was in worse shape than you thought it was. And it takes a while for all that stuff to accumulate. And it takes a while when it accumulates for you to get to the point where you can say, where I need to turn off this contract, because turning stuff off is hard. Starting it is hard. Everything's hard about this, right? It's big, tens of millions of dollar contracts. It's hard to get things rolling, and it's hard to get them to stop. I had a situation once where I had a problem with my car. It sounded really, really bad. And I end up taking it in. I get towed for 45 minutes to Enterprise, Alabama. Do a search for Enterprise, Alabama boll weevil statue. So I get towed to Enterprise, Alabama, and they call me up and they say, okay, we know that your engine has this problem. And I forget, something with coil in it. Yeah, like some sort of coil on one of the cylinders. We know that that's burned out. That's dead. We don't know if there's any other problems with your engine. And we can't know until we fix the coil. Fixing the coil is going to be like $400 plus labor. So I'm like locked into spending $600 before I can make the decision about whether it's worth spending more money.
Mm-hmm.
The other alternative was buying a new car during COVID, because this all happened during COVID when cars were insane. And I'm trapped in Enterprise, Alabama. Luckily, there was a Nissan dealer there. Those were the people I was working with. But I'm in Enterprise, Alabama. My bank is not in Enterprise, Alabama. So luckily, I said, yeah, go ahead and spend the money. And they fixed it. And that turned out to be the only problem. But there was a question about whether there was something else going on, because my car was running so rough when it gave up the ghost and it started doing the thing. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see parts on the highway. So that sometimes you can't really tell until you spend a bunch of money. So, and in this case, they were trying to reinvent the world. And you can argue that there's certainly a lot of blame to go around. I don't want to make anybody think that LCS was this paragon of efficiently run programs, et cetera, et cetera. There was a lot of blame to go around. But the mere fact that they tried to do something ambitious and they failed is not by itself indication that there was a specific problem. You can also do modular submarines. I love this submarine. This is a Swedish. Do you know how to say that?
What, Blekinge?
Is that Blekinge? Is that how you say that?
That's how I say it.
Well, you're the Finn in the group in Sweden.
Yeah, but Finnish and Swedish don't even come close to each other.
Oh, yeah. I'm from Iowa. They're the same thing.
Ooh, ow.
So in any event, you've got these modular submarines that you can do either a short one that's a coastal version, or a medium-sized one that's got some blue water capability, or a long-range sub. The Swedes are basically build the medium-sized one, and Swedish submarines are sort of a recurring theme is that they'll go in for a refit and they'll swap out modules and stuff, and they kind of have a new submarine when they're done. Now, does that mean that swapping out a module magically means that the hull does not have any hull fatigue from all the previous excursions that it did? Well, first of all, it's probably not going to test depth a whole lot. So the hull fatigue is probably on the low side to begin with, ish. And the second thing is it does, maybe it doesn't solve the problems of an old hull for the older parts of the boat, but it does give you a lot of new capabilities. So I just love the idea of doing this. And basically, when you go to the different versions, most of what you're adding is fuel tanks, because this is a diesel electric submarine. So you're adding fuel tanks so that you can go further. You're adding endurance. Endurance is going to be a theme. Okay, so here's a few things. I already talked about the little crappy ship story from ProPublica. That's that first one. The second one is the thing that I've pulled a lot of stuff from for tonight and will for next week. The third one is one that I honestly haven't read yet. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing it in 2 sessions is I want to read that one, because in 2004, Bob Work does one where he says, here's why I think this is an experiment worth doing. By 2013, there was a lot of information about how that experiment was going, and I want to sort of compare and contrast the two. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the things that he specifically said in the document. This is really sort of a scene setter. I'm pulling stuff from his document. So he talks about small combatants as being 3,000 tons or less, medium being 3,000 to 12,000, and he calls that category intermediate, but I'm going to call it medium, and large being 12,000 tons or more. And those breakpoints are not arbitrary. He picked those for a reason, and he gives the details about why he picks those for a reason. I do not see any problems with those as categories. Chris, how do they work for you?
Oh, I would have something on the lower end, the coastal side, but other than that, those breakdowns look pretty good to me.
Yeah. Well, he specifically, one of the things that he points out in this, he talks about how in the post-war era, he talks about total battle force ships, and he defines those as ships that are capable of escorting aircraft carriers, which means keeping up with the carrier. And a high sprint speed is useful, but the real important thing is sustained speed, because that's what you kind of need to be able to stick with the carrier. And the carrier is frequently booking along at 25 knots because it wants 25 knots of wind over the deck to launch and recover aircraft. And if it doesn't, if you're in dead calm seas, that means it has to be going at 25 knots. The other thing about aircraft carriers is you can watch the replay on the radar scope, and you can tell exactly whether there's an aircraft carrier involved or not, because aircraft carriers will point into the wind and they go at a steady speed while they're doing flight ops. And then they do a 180-degree turn and run as fast as they can in the other direction. Then they turn around and kind of do the same thing over again, right? Because they're trying to stay within a specific box generally, and they come back around and they're constantly doing this racetrack thing. And so you need a certain amount of speed to be able to keep up with the carrier. And as he points out, most ships below 3,000 tons really can't do it. And the last ship that did this that was really escorting aircraft carriers that was that small was the Fletcher class. And over time, as air defense requirements increased and the speed of aircraft carriers increased and the endurance of aircraft carriers increased, you needed more endurance from the small ships, and they needed to have more missile tubes in order to defend aircraft carriers, and all those things pointed to bigger ships. So we start off with the Fletcher class, and then the L&M Sumner class came after it, was approximately the same size. And then you get the Gearing class, which was the first. They were designed during the war, but they didn't come out until basically the end of the war. The Gearings hung around for a while, but they were more than 3,000 tons, and everything we built to escort aircraft carriers since then has been more than 3,000 tons. On the other end, you lost most of the, you ended up losing most of the high-end stuff, like true cruisers all went away as well. And so you end up with a bunch of medium-sized ships escorting aircraft carriers for most of the Cold War. And then you finally end up with a situation where you've only got a handful of different ship classes that are doing all the heavy lifting. I mean, right now, you've got a couple of Zumwalt class destroyers that I don't know what their deployment pattern for those look like. You've got the various flavors of Arleigh Burke, and the Ticonderogas are leaving the force. The Navy hopes to get rid of all the Ticonderogas by like 2026, 2027, something like that.
I thought it was 2027.
Yeah, something like that. Congress may not let them, because there are some people in Congress that say, we need the tubes, so we're not going to let you decommission those. The Navy response to that is, they're not seaworthy. We're never going to send them to sea. So you are not getting us any more tubes by making us keep ships that have to be manned and have to be maintained, yet are still not capable of deploying. So like if you go down to Norfolk, you can look at Vicksburg in the yard. She's still in the rolls. They've stripped all of her radars. Like all of her antennas are gone. The Spy 1 antennas are still there, but everything else is gone. That ship's never going anyplace again, because they've discovered when they took her in to do the refit, they discovered that they had so many problems with the hull. And this apparently is a recurring problem with the Ticonderogas, the Tychos just have issues with their hulls, and they've been rode hard and put away wet, and now we're paying the price.
Well, it's largely a Spruance hull.
Yeah, it
and
is.
They threw a lot more weight on it.
Yeah, in fact, if you look there, a Spruance hull is what, 8,000 tons, and a Ticonderoga is 9.5.
They're more than that, but
yeah, that's what's listed as the full load displacement. All my numbers come from Wikipedia, so we know it's got to be right. It came from Wikipedia. It's got to be good. So, and also the other thing over time is that the Navy slowly left the small combatant business. It just got out of it altogether. Part of it was because this was something the Allies could do. They weren't going to bring a lot of big ships to the fight, a lot of our allies, but they had smaller shipyards. They could bring small ships to the fight. And, if we're talking about Europe, we're going to be fighting there, right? So the plan is we go there and we fight there. And so if they've got ships that are home ported there, they don't have to have a lot of transoceanic capability. And so they can make do with small ships. And so this was a win-win for everybody. And we build big ships that were suitable for global commitments, for crossing oceans and all the rest. And they build small ships that were basically more regional in their focus, and everybody wins. The Allies then decided they needed bigger ships too. And now we don't have a small ship capability. We haven't built a small ship in forever.
We walked away from small ships when for cost-cutting reasons, we got rid of overseas basing.
Yeah.
Which means everything's got to come from here.
Yeah.
And small ships, just, you can't downsize fuel. That's one of those laws of physics that keep coming back to bite you.
Yeah.
So that's why they're not as useful to us, because we got rid of the infrastructure that would be necessary to keep them in theater.
And this is a recurring theme. History may not repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And I would argue science fiction can and probably should rhyme as well. The Brits spent a lot of time wondering how the Germans, I'm talking about World War I Brits, World War I Germans, how the Germans were able to get the performance that they got out of the ships that they had. And then once they got on board those ships after the Germans lost World War I and they surrendered, they went, oh my God, now I understand how they did it. They used high efficiency boilers that were almost impossible to maintain at sea. They had really crappy berthing because the German High Seas Fleet was misnamed. It should have been called the German North Seas Fleet. And the German concept of operations was, we're never going to deploy for more than 2 weeks at a time, and anybody can put up with anything for 2 weeks, and then we'll go back into port and we'll have a bunch of contractors, shipyard workers in addition to our crew. Stuff we can't maintain at sea, we can maintain in port. Whereas the Brits were thinking very much in terms of, India is a long ways away. The China station is a long ways away. So everything they built was designed to be easily serviceable in the field. And they assumed that people were going to be living on the ship for months, if not years at a time. And so those different sets of design requirements led to much different construction. And I look at some of the things I see in, for instance, like Star Trek. There's a reason why a Constitution class ship is as big as it is. There's a reason why the Galaxy class is even bigger, right? They figured that these people were going to be alone and unafraid a lot. They needed a big ship. They needed a lot of room. They needed a large enough crew that every now and then you might see a face that you hadn't seen, 15 minutes earlier, et cetera, et cetera. So, One Horse Shay says it sounds like Federation versus Klingon designs, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. One of the things that we don't see anybody really get into, you certainly don't see it in Star Trek, and you don't usually see it. Every now and then you get hints of it in science fiction, is humans have certain minimum requirements in order to not go crazy on a ship. Do Klingons have the same requirements? I mean, I'd like to have my own room, right? Do Klingons feel like they need their own room? Do Klingons need personal space? Or are they perfectly happy living in a barracks? Are they perfectly happy not having any recreational facilities, right? It might even be that they don't want lots of space. Right? Insert whatever alien you want to insert there, right? It may be that they don't actually want to have that extra space involved because whatever society they come from, they're used to being sort of cheek and jowl. Now, Chuck Gannon, who I want to have on the show at one point in one of the Kane Reardon novels, has a situation where they go on board an alien ship and they notice things like that, and they make some assumptions about the environment that the crew came from. They conclude that they probably lived underground based upon some of the things based upon basically how the ship was laid out and stuff like that. They concluded they probably lived underground. I remember, I think Chuck and I were sharing a room at a con one time, and I said, I give you an A. It's a fantastic book. I give you an A for effort because that's exactly the sort of analysis that they should be doing. The only problem I have with it is they made a bunch of guesses on very little information, and every single guess turned out to be correct. And this is the sort of thing that if you were an intel guy in this situation, which his main character is, you might put some stuff on sticky notes up on the wall, but you would expect that a lot of those things were going to be wrong. That's okay. Intel guys are used to getting stuff wrong. We do it all the time because we make we make assessments based on little information frequently. And did you ever meet Mark Lowenthal?
I think I met him briefly. The name's familiar.
Yeah, do you know? So he makes the argument that there are two different kinds of intel problems. There are batting problems and there are fielding problems. And fielding problems are the one that if you only get the answer correct 95% of the time, your boss is going to be telling you that you need to really step up your game because you should be getting that one right like 100% of the time. But for batting problems, if you're right about a third of the time, you're fantastic. They love you. Yeah. And the problem I had with some of that stuff is that this is a batting problem. They shouldn't be batting 1,000. They shouldn't be batting 1,000. They really shouldn't.
Yeah.
So, okay, I should probably move on. And so I think, Chris, that we're probably going to do your stuff next time.
Okay.
So, in fact, I suspect this is going to be a threefer. But in any event, Work talks about the missions of small combatants, and he lists 10 missions of small combatants. And then he says there's an 11th one that might be a new one, and that's emplacing network sensors for your battle network. But he talks about battle force screening and battle fleet scouting, mine warfare, protection of shipping. I mean, you all can read the list there. And so these were all things that small combatants used to do. But remember, we stopped deploying small combatants with the battle force because they just couldn't keep up. They didn't have the endurance. They didn't have enough missile tubes. And so those missions are kind of deprecated. But so you've got these other 7 missions there. And if you look at the attributes of those ships, they have shallow draft. What you need for those missions, you need shallow draft. You need to be highly maneuverable. But you also need cover against bigger threats because if something can come out and eat you. And if you look at that, that's really what Julian Corbett's talking about when he talks about the flotilla versus the battle fleet, right? You have the flotilla goes in and does its inshore work, and it does it sort of, day in, day out, laying the minefields, taking the mines out, doing patrol, interdiction, stuff like that, catching blockade runners, etc. But there has to be some serious battle force capable ships nearby, because every now and then the bad guys might come out and try to whack one of your guys. They might bring a light cruiser out to try to snap up some of your small boys. So you need to be able to prepare to cover them. And so you may not have to cover them directly with, I've got a gun there ready to shoot now, but you at least need to be able to present a credible threat that if I send my light cruiser out, he may end up facing a battle cruiser, and it would be a bad day for him, right? So this is sort of the missions of all the different ships that he's talking about. And then he goes on to talk about how when the battle force operates close to shore, it's really focused on the shore. It's focused on getting the guys ashore. It's focused on taking out things that are ashore, like, airfields and other things like that are ashore. And that he talks about how this is becoming even more so over time. And the reason why it's becoming even more so over time, the phrase he uses is, potential adversaries are exporting their battle lines ashore. It basically boils down to, I can fit a lot more airplanes on a country than I can on a ship. And in the days of anti-ship ballistic missiles and coastal defense cruise missiles, et cetera, my entire country can now be something that can shoot at a ship. And I'm going to have to take that stuff down before I land troops on. So my big guns, metaphorically speaking, are going to have to go at least far enough inshore, and they're going to be focused on that. And because they're doing that mission, they're potentially vulnerable. Now, one of the things I want to talk about either next time or the time after that, probably the time after that, remember we talked about orbital is the new littoral, and interface is a replacement for amphibious when you run it through the science fiction converter. So it's interesting thinking about all the implications of that and whether that holds true. Like, are you going to put your anti-space defenses on the planet? I'm not sure that part holds true. I think that may be qualitatively different. But for the scenario that Work is talking about, because strangely, Bob Work, and in all of his work, I've never heard him mention starships even once. The man's only got one fault, as near as I can tell. He talks about how if your big guns are focused ashore, something's got to be protecting them from sort of small localized threats. Presumably, they've taken the other guy's battle force. If the other guy's got a significant navy, they've been taken out of the picture. But they might have things like, I just lost my light. I now know how long the battery on my ring light lasts, and the answer is not long enough. So as these ships are focused ashore, there potentially can be threatened by mines. So if you're able to clandestinely deploy mines, that could be an issue. They can be threatened by submarines. They can be threatened by fast attack craft or torpedo type craft, things like that. And so those are the sorts of threats that small combatants are designed to deal with. And so, yeah, basically this is his idea of where the LCS comes from. You need something in the littorals that is focused towards the seaward threats, while the intermediate size ships are focused ashore, while the battle force is focused ashore. Any thoughts on that, Chris?
The 11th mission that Wark talks about in his 2004 paper, you see that heavily emphasized in the LCS.
Yeah.
As being a sensor node within the sensor grid for network-centric warfare. You see that a lot, where the LCS is to deploy a UAV or USV or something, sprint to the next location, deploy another one, and basically build a temporary sensor net.
Yeah.
And you and I see that a lot in science fiction. It's
yes.
this ubiquitous reconnaissance drone.
And it's funny because, work talks about how in the next slide, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to go to the next slide and then we'll talk about it. Boy, there are a lot of words on that slide.
There are quite a few.
Yeah. And so the reason I do stuff like this, there's 3 reasons why I do stuff like this. And I will admit that one of them is just that with just-in-time slide delivery, words are easier than pictures. The second thing is so that people can freeze frame it and just read the words.
Right.
So that's what most of this is a lightly edited quotes with some different formatting from Bob Work's stuff. So this is just basically a page out of his thing that I popped in there. The other thing is, and this is a sort of a recurring reason, like, why do I bother to do this at all? Because a lot of the stuff I could do, I could just not have slides. Well, then you have to look at me. At least now you've got something else you can look at. And also, like, if you're fast forwarding it, trying to find the area where I talked about something or where one of my guests talked about something, it's easier if you've got something visual to key off of. So by putting the slides in, people can follow the argument to the point where if they want to listen to it again. So I do it this way on purpose. That having been said, boy, is that type small. But basically, he talks about how there's 4 different types of access problems of increasing levels of complexity and difficulty. You've got unimpeded access, where basically the opponent doesn't have any ability to do anything to you whatsoever. Mm-hmm. You've got what he calls guarded access, which means basically one of 2 things. Either they've got a fishing fleet that or something like that sort of like a naval functions as a naval auxiliary and can let headquarters know when you come into the area, or they've got a Coast Guard. And that basically boils down to they've got sensors, but they don't have any ability to actually do anything with those sensors. All they can do is just sort of prepare the stuff ashore. They don't really have the ability to attack you at sea. The third, defended access, means they've got some capability, and that capability can either be in the form of like suicide boats or, fast attack craft or mines or things like that. Or what they've got is a very small, very focused naval or air capability. So they can come out and play. They can't do it that much, but they can do enough that you need to be on your guard, right? It's a threat. You need to be able to defend yourself. And then the last one is contested access, which means you're fighting a navy. All the attributes of a navy. They got sensors, they got weapons, they're coming to kill you. Or they'd at least like to, right? And LCS wasn't really designed for contested access. And as I, at one point he talks about how people say that you could just send the LCS, have it run ahead and put in the sensor network while you're waiting for all the other ships to show up. And that's a good way to get a lot of good people killed. Because if they're out there by themselves, if they're not under the cover of the battle force, they're probably going to get killed. And so don't do that. And that's a dumb argument to make. And it's funny watching all the LCS arguments. I have this flashback to all the World War I battle cruiser arguments. Not that they're analogous, but that when you say like, well, what's the purpose of a battle cruiser, or what, how would you use it, or what is a battle cruiser? You ask 5 different theorists of the time period and you get 6 different answers. They weren't really in agreement. Fisher didn't agree with all the people that were later implementing the stuff that he bought. And so you have people saying, well, the purpose of LCS is to do X, when it's like, really? Is that really what the purpose is? Why would you do that? Now, the one document that might actually be able to settle this, I haven't been able to get my hands on, and that is, he referenced it a couple of times. It's the Littoral Combat Ship Concept of Operations, Volume or version 3.1, if I remember correctly. And there's a link in the paper that links it to the globalsecurity.org website, but the globalsecurity.org website wants you to subscribe to be able to get to it. So I haven't been able to find it anyplace else. He's got a lot of really good stuff in his footnotes, and I search for it, and the only place I find a reference to it is in that paper. And some of that stuff came from a guy named Al Elkins. I know Al Elkins. Haven't talked to him in 15 years, but there was a time period where my path and Al's path crossed very regularly because we overlapped a little bit. We overlapped some when I was at CNA. He was up in Newport, and we overlapped when I first got to Newport before he retired. And so I need to look up Al, see how he's doing, and say, hey, all that stuff you sent Bob worked. Can you send me a copy? I'd love to see it too. I'd like to put it online. So, any thoughts on this breakdown of the problem here? Does this ring true to you?
The description is, and I think the Marine Corps has done similar assessments, for trying to figure out amphibious lift and what kind of force structure they're going to get. And we talked about this the last time, that they've now moved themselves into where contested access is really not in their repertoire, because they're moving to very light forces and whatnot. You can say, is that wrong? Is that right? You're looking into a crystal ball. But the problem I have with some of this is that you have this discussion going on at the same time the Navy is talking about the decline in battle force ships.
Mm-hmm.
And they're lumping the LCS into the battle force. If for no other reasons to bolster numbers. Well, where I come from, that's a Potemkin village.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a long history in our Navy and other navies of defining your terms in such a way to make the point you want to make, right? We had a cruiser gap. We solved it with the stroke of a pen. The CNO said, hey, that Ticonderoga class DDG, let's call it a cruiser instead. And the cruiser gap is gone. We're now building cruisers. Same exact design. Nothing changed. It's just we're calling it a cruiser. And it solved the problem. It actually did solve the problem. The Brits have done things in reverse, right? They had aircraft carriers that they called through deck cruisers because they didn't want, and other people have done this with calling big ships, like calling destroyers, calling them frigates, because they wanted to convince their electorate that they were being frugal. So we're building small ships.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you get into the entire thing. We talked earlier when we talked yesterday, I think it was, about the against the Glossary of Naval Ship Types is what GINT stands for. And if you go back in the archives of Starfleet Tactical, I talked about it like in episode 30 or something like that a long time ago, about how the Office of Naval Intelligence, part of the United States Navy, defines what red forces are.
Actually, it went bigger than that, Chris. That started as a thing.
Yep. I was ducking a lot of history there, but you would know it better than I. And so at one point, Chris and I were both at various points in our career players in the process whereby naming and typing happened. And I think I've told people on the show that at one point I had essentially the same level of influence in the real world as I did in the Honor Harrington universe. And it was my goal to have like to influence the name of a new ship in the real world and influence the name of a ship in the Honorverse in the same way, so that like there could be a Shang class such and such in the real world and a Shang class ship in the Honorverse at the same time. I never came anywhere close to doing it, but it was my dream to be able to do both, and only a handful of people would know that I had done that on purpose. Yeah, it's what I was about to say is the United States Navy does not follow with blue forces the same classification scheme that it follows with red forces. If you look at the submarine force, and you use the O&I rules, we only have 2 SSNs in the entire force. Because everything else would be an SSGN because it's got those vertical launch tubes in it. So, yeah, Stephen Ross points out Japan has a destroyer that carries F-35s. When they built it, it didn't have the capability to carry F-35s, but they built it in such a way that they could upgrade it, and they have upgraded it. And they call it an aviation carrying destroyer or something. Aviation destroyer.
Yeah, something like that.
Something in Japanese that we translated in English is that. Just like the Kuznetsov is officially in Russian a heavy aviation cruiser, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, TAKR.
Yeah, and in all actuality, they really kind of view it. It's fashionable to say that the only reason they did that is because of the Montreux Convention and the restrictions on taking it through the Bosporus. I don't think that's it at all. I think they named it how they intend to use it, because they've never had this sort of Western idea that it's their capital ship and they're going to build everything around it. They've always considered that to be a support for their surface forces.
You gotta go one more. Okay. Everything, if you read Gorshkov, you figure this out pretty quick. Everything is to support submarines.
Yeah. Yep.
Because that was their primary offensive arm.
Yeah.
And the Kievs had the ability to schwack the carrier, and the Yak 38s could scare a P3. That was about all they could scare. They could scare a P3.
Even a Yak 38 could scare a P3. So, yeah, it's interesting that, was it Lockheed Martin that builds the F-35, that they decided that the place to go get the technology to do vertical lift was the Russians?
Well, that was the Yak 41.
Yeah, that was the Yak 41, and not the Brits.
Well, the Brits got us the Harrier.
Yeah. And I like the approach of the Harrier a lot better than I like the approach of the Yak 41.
Thrust. You're not going to get the thrust out of a Harrier approach. You're just not. And you're certainly not going to get a supersonic aircraft out of it.
Yeah.
And the Yak 41 was specifically a supersonic VSTOL.
We should have just told the Marines no. We should have just told the Marines no. But I think you can't really fully understand that decision without noticing the fact that we built a couple of LHAs that didn't have well decks.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this conspiracy between the commandant and the chief of naval operations to build a couple of light aircraft carriers and not tell them.
Yeah.
So I think that's hilarious. I always thought that was hilarious.
Chinese believe it.
So the light carrier versus heavy carrier debate is something that's probably worth adding. He grabs his pen.
Just remember, grab the 1998 GAO study as your starting point.
I don't know about that one.
It was all about why should we keep building nuclear-powered carriers.
Okay, I'll take a look at that because it was interesting. When I was at CNA, there was the light carrier faction and there was the heavy carrier faction.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to see some of the heavy carrier faction stuff. And the heavy carrier stuff basically focused on efficiencies, right? You half the size of the flight deck and you end up cutting the air wing by way more than half.
Yeah.
So you have the flight deck goes down by a factor, half the size of the flight deck, and you end up with a quarter the number of airplanes approximately. And you end up, I'm sorry, what?
However,
if
you look at the emphasis of the light carrier guys, is they say we have more hulls and therefore have a better deployment posture and can actually maintain more aircraft in theater than with a big guy.
And they might be right.
Well, given how bad we're flogging our carriers right now, I think they are right.
Yeah, I will admit I don't have a dog in that fight. I mean, I've never sat down and really sort of figured it out. In part because I know that what I probably want is a lot of big carriers. And so I can't have a lot of big carriers. So it's an argument between a lot of carriers and big carriers, right? Which one do I get? Do I get a lot of carriers or do I get big carriers? You can make the argument in some cases that you don't want big carriers because all eggs in one basket sort of stuff, which, okay, that's why I want a lot of them. It's not like small carriers are any more survivable than big carriers. And even small carriers are really big, non-stealthy targets. So from a targeting perspective, the difference between a big carrier and a small carrier is they're effectively the same. It's a big barn versus a small barn. You're still hitting a barn, right? So there are some efficiencies to be gained by having a big carrier. If you got some esoteric piece of test gear, you only need one, but you need one per carrier, right? Maybe I don't need as many.
But some people would also say those efficiencies basically show themselves during time of peace.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's always been one of the differences between the Russians' philosophy of building stuff and the US's philosophy of building stuff. We build stuff for maintainability in peace. They build stuff for performance in war. And
and that's because if you look at their philosophy has always been be ready to go to sea.
Yeah.
Where our emphasis has been be at sea.
Yeah. And I said performance in war. That came across wrong. They look at things and say if an airplane like the Tarantal class patrol corvette is a great example of that. It had combined diesel and gas engines, the gas turbine. The gas turbines were only rated for 26 hours because you're not going to use them that much, and then the ship is probably going to die.
And what did they use for cooling?
I don't know. What did they use?
Seawater.
Oh, hey, I understand that seawater can dissolve your ship. In fact, you really shouldn't put your ship anywhere near seawater.
Kind of unavoidable, I think.
I didn't get a chance to go on board Tarantal the last time I was up in Fall River, and they're going to scrap her. In fact, they probably have already.
Yeah, I got to see Hindusy when she came over.
Ah, did you go on board?
Yeah.
Were you at sea with her?
No, she was tied up at the pier, but we crawled all the way up and down and left and right.
I've crawled over her a couple of times because she was up in Fall River for a long time. So Hidden Sea was a Russian Tarantal, was a East German owned, but Russian designed and Russian built Tarantal class corvette. So it was basically a fast missile boat. And it was parked right next to the battleship Massachusetts. So, but the last time I was there, I think that you couldn't go on board her, if I remember correctly.
Well, I don't think they're taking care of her very well.
Well, I think that was it. Is that they needed a whole bunch of work and they just didn't have the ability to do it, so they were going to scrap her. So, which is just it's a shame. So I just realized I got one more slide, so I should go ahead and do it. And then I'll go through the comments to see if there are any questions. So what we're going to do in the future is we're going to examine the arguments that Robert Work makes about the arguments he makes for small combatants and for modular capabilities, etc. Examine whether the LCS we got matches what he talks about. And then examine whether the LCS we got was a good experiment, right? Did we get the thing, and did we meet the experimental goals with the thing that we got? And then I want to think about all the above in science fiction terms, already having started that conversation with the orbital littoral analogy and the interface amphibious analogy, etc. And Chris has done some thinking about that, which goes back to that earlier question on one of the early slides, like the second slide about what do Honor Harrington and the LCS have in common.
Or could
have in common. Okay, so let me go back to the beginning and scroll through real quick. Let's see. Let's see. We talked about battle stations. I'll talk more about battle stations. Stephen Ross says he tried an icebreaker simulator at the Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. I know that I am definitely not the guy you want manning the helm. I was on board the USS Porter, and I got asked twice, once by the captain. The captain said, "Hey, did they offer to let you drive?" And we were out tooling around off of vacapes, and I said to him, "Yes, they did, sir. Thank you very much, but I don't think my license includes this class of vehicle." And so I don't know if I'd be any good driving a destroyer, but of course they weren't going to. I was just going to stand there with my hands on the wheel. I wasn't actually going to get the thing. So I decided that was a line I did not want to cross for me personally, because I was that close to going native the entire time I was there. And as a analyst who was there sort of on board to sort of watch stuff, I needed to I could not maintain that level of objectivity if I'm actually touching the gear. Wright says cracked hull is still considered bad, correct?
It is still considered very bad.
Very bad. Let's see, some talking about specifics for various Star Trek ships. So Wright asked the question, could you operate F-35Bs? That's the vertical launch variant from LCS. My guess is that there's two critical factors there that you have to think about. One is the weight of the deck, and the second is, are you going to melt a hole in the deck? Because
aluminum hull.
Yeah, aluminum hull. Now, I don't know if somebody thought ahead and said, we're going to go ahead and make it beefy enough to deal with that and put the fireproofing on, it might be okay, but I'd be surprised if they did that.
Yeah, if they thought that far ahead.
Yeah, F-35 burns incredibly hot.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to develop new non-skid for it because it was burning off all the non-skid and all sorts of things. So it is not as much as they would like it to be, is not a plug and play replacement. In addition to that, it's got some limitations on the amount of bring back it can have, so what it can come back to the boat with. And it's also got some limitations on just its, what it can launch with, because it does not have, it's not catapult capable. When I asked the question, because we were briefed on this at CNA, when I asked the question, is there any chance that they could put a catapult bar on the front of it? They just laughed at me. It's like, yeah, no. The gear is not stressed for it. They're at the point where they're desperate to get rid of weight, or at least they were at that point. Yeah, it's just not going to happen. And so there's implications for when you start replacing F-18s, Marine F-18s that deploy on carriers with F-35Bs, there are implications. All that's 20 years old. So I assume that there's fixes and changes to the schedule, et cetera, to make up for the implications of having F-35Bs, but I don't know what they were.
Well, if I had to guess, I think the F-35B is twice the weight of a SH-60 hull.
Probably. It's a lot of engine, and engines are dense.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So there was a hull down system like RAST in the Canadian Navy that they had a long time ago.
Yeah, bear trap.
Wright asked the question, I wonder if LCS has enough power to supply electronic warfare gear. I have no idea what their excess power is. I mean, they've got a lot of turbine capability because they can go fast, but I don't know how good they are at converting that into electrical.
Well, yeah, if you're talking passive sensors, remember a lot of the stuff we used to do early on in the 70s and the 80s was by vans.
Yeah.
That you would park on. So, yeah, the LCS could probably do that. But then you start getting into, is her sensor suite laid out in such a way that she doesn't interfere? Because those ships that do that sort of thing, they pay attention to that. Your radars, your transmitters, good grief. We look at it even as whether or not any of that stuff will set off an explosive.
Yeah. And it's always, whenever anybody says something like, well, why don't you put the such and such on the airplane? It's like, no, you don't understand. You're talking about something that has an antenna. The paperwork will take 300 years to fill out. So One Horse Shay brings up the question of internal arrangement of Federation ships different depending on the member species crew. Well, that's an interesting question, because you go back to the original series and some of the stuff that's pretty darn close to canon around that, like, for instance, the making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield and some of the things that happen in episodes. And they've got, there was one of the starships was an entirely Vulcan crew. And there's been other sort of semi-canon sources that talk about the idea that there's a lot more species, let's call it national crewing, that in a lot of ways, I think, especially in the early days, Starfleet is a lot more like Standing Naval Force Atlantic than it is like the US Navy. They may all say Starfleet on the outside, but I get the impression that, there's the ships built by the Earth guys, and then there's the ships built by other people, and they all have the same paint job, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily all the same. You only get hints of that, and I think by the time of Picard, that's all gone away. So Logic's Finest asks the question, is there any benefit to mounting an 8-inch or 11-inch gun on a small combatant for more firepower against a larger threat? Are we talking a full-size turret at that point? So first of all, the guns are big and heavy, and they're up high, relatively speaking, and so that's a problem. And second of all, they require a lot of bracing because they when they fire, there's a lot of vibration and there's a lot of force, and they require a lot of handling gear below deck, and their magazines have to be larger. And so by the time you add all that stuff up, the answer is no, you're not putting a big gun on a small ship.
They remember the test platform for the 8-inch automatic was the hull, USS Hull. And when they started shooting that thing, it was cracking the main deck.
Yeah.
As well as some of the supports.
What class was the hull?
I want to say it was like a Forrest Sherman.
Okay. So small.
Yeah.
So yeah. In fact, the other thing is that for some of this stuff, it's like, what does it get you? So that was specifically part of the discussion with the LCS, is like, and for some of these smaller things, if you don't need to have a long range weapon or a big weapon like that, putting one in causes problems. Now, Chris might be able to, Chris, can you tell what I'm thinking? Can you tell what I'm thinking?
Are you thinking about DDG?
No, I'm thinking about Nemo or Amos.
Oh, yeah.
So Nemo and Amos are two, one's Swedish and the other one is Finnish, if I remember correctly. They are large mortars. So they're 120 millimeters, but they only shoot out like 10 miles. I think one's 10 and one's 12.
That's with a standard mortar round. If you go with a wrap round, they can go further.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a relatively big gun. It can carry a relatively big boom, but because it's a low velocity mortar, as opposed to being a high velocity, like you're not going to be penetrating armored bunkers with it through kinetics, but it does carry a pretty big boom. And you can do things like single gun time on target shots, where you can put 5 or 6 rounds and on varying trajectories so that they all land at the same spot at the same time. It's really pretty cool.
And you can put it on a speedboat.
Yeah, and you can put it on something that's really, really small, because it doesn't. The gun itself doesn't have to sustain a whole lot of shock, and the mounting for the gun doesn't have to sustain a whole lot of shock. So relatively speaking, it's a light weapon with a light mount. And so it's really, really cool. So I actually think, and I don't know what studies have been done, et cetera, but there's some funky things you can do with it. I think it would be an excellent weapon for something the size of LCS. I could be totally and completely out to lunch on that. Chris, am I totally and completely out to lunch on that?
I don't think so. If you look at what the LCS was supposed to do, anti-swarm, a shallow water ASW, a 120 millimeter mortar with the appropriate rounds would do both jobs very nicely. Thank you.
Yeah. And it's a big gun, but it's something you could.
Well, it's a large bore. It's actually not that big a gun.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. It's a large caliber. It's a large caliber, but it's not a long gun. It's not a heavy barrel. It's smooth bore, amongst other things. It's a tube. It's a bloody lightweight tube. So if you go on YouTube and do a search for Amos or Nemo or Amos,
Amos, I remember, yeah.
If you do a search for Swedish mortar boat, I think was the search that I did for it. You can find this one of this. I mean, that it's a surprisingly small ship with a surprisingly large weapon. So let's see. I'm scrolling down, So navies aren't building large fighting ships anymore. Some of them are getting bigger, actually. The small ships are getting bigger, I guess would be the way to phrase it.
The Type 055 on the China side is we haven't seen it in operation, but based on everything we've seen of it, it's a very fine looking ship.
Yeah, and it's basically a cruiser size ship.
Yeah, but it doesn't have a cruiser size magazine. Okay, they barely match up with a Burke.
Yeah. So Logic's Finest says, isn't the Kuznetsov out of service?
They're still trying to fix her. She's in a graving dock.
Yeah. They haven't dropped anything new on her recently. They haven't set her on fire recently.
That's true. Although it wasn't ship's force. I mean, the dry dock, I've read a number of Russian reports. It just scares you. They lost power. And the dry dock actually has its own power supply. But they didn't buy any fuel. And they didn't have enough people to run it.
Nope, I'm not going to feel sorry for them. I refuse to feel sorry for the Russians. I refuse to do that. Let's see. Okay. There's a long discussion about the Avro air car.
Goodness gracious.
So going back to that icebreaker comment that Stephen Ross made, he said, it was the delay between turning the wheel and the ship actually turning. I massively oversteered.
Oh, I'm sure.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
Advancing transfer is a cruel mistress.
And ships handle like pigs.
Submarines are even worse on the surface.
Yep.
Where, half of your rudder's flapping in the breeze.
So Logic's Finest says, Chris specifically said the nose gear isn't strong enough to accommodate a catapult launch. I recall seeing F-35 being catapulted from the forward. What I said was the F-35 Bravo can't be catapulted because the gear isn't strong enough because it's not designed to be catapulted. There are 3 different models of the F-35, and by 3, I mean 4. That's because the Israelis are special. But there's the A model, that's the Air Force model, the C model, that is the Navy model, and the B model, that is the Marine Corps model. And the C model has beefier gear, and it's bigger wings, and there's some other cosmetic differences and stuff. But if you look at the landing gear, you can tell because it's got 2 nose wheels as opposed to 1 nose wheel. And it has, and the gear is just heavier gear, so it's designed to do catapult stuff.
Yeah, designed for catapult and arrested landing. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So wasn't the Alaska class It's actually a CB, not a CA. The test
large
bed
cruiser.
for the automatic 8-inch gun. And I'm not.
No, you're thinking the Des Moines.
Yeah, I think he's thinking the Des Moines.
Des Moines class with the fixed 8-inch gun. It wasn't automatic. It was fixed ammunition. So it had a faster rate of fire. The Alaska class ran around with 12-inch 50s.
The Alaska class were all gone by like 1950 anyway.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
50, 52, something like that.
You really could. Why we built them is it's a silly story.
Yeah, the short version is we built them to counteract a threat that did not exist, a Japanese ship that did not exist, because the Japanese ship did exist, but it wasn't supposed to be the thing that we thought it was going to be. But because we bought the Alaskas, the Japanese said, "Oh, we need to beef up our ship." So by virtue of the fact that we decided to buy the Alaskas, we actually created the threat that we were trying to counteract. So actions have consequences. Okay, so that's it. And if we end it now, we can not have the longest show we've ever done, but we're still pretty close.
Let's not set any precedences then.
Yeah. So Chris, thank you for coming on as always. It's always a pleasure to have you on. And we will do something like this probably next week. I'll let you speak with your lovely bride to find out if you're doing anything next Saturday night.
Next week is probably fine. The week after, I'm at Historicon.
Okay. So I will get my act together, including the Vallejo stuff, so that if we end up going to 3 sessions, then I will have something I can slot in between. And then my travel schedule gets all wonky in there too, because next week shouldn't be a problem. But on Monday after, so next Saturday I'm good. But the following Monday, I leave for the Florida Panhandle. And so
have fun.
Yes. Well, I will get to see a former coworker who I like a great deal, and I will get to participate in a war game down there, and I will probably get to see Wright Sublette. So if his schedule and my schedule can sync up, and I'm also going to try to go see John Trimble.
Oh, okay.
So, and depending upon how it all works out, I may get to see like the 4th largest pyramid in the world, and a big ass Bass Pro Shop. So we'll see.
All righty.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next week.